So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, which is a think tank established in 1985 to increase diversity of the thought on the economy and related public policy areas. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this discussion today about our latest research publication in partnership with the Diffley Partnership, which is Understanding Scotland's Economy. We do this every quarter and it tracks public perceptions of the economy in Scotland over time. Each quarter, it helps monitor and understand economic perceptions, spending intentions and attitudes in Scotland. And this is vital information for decision makers across all sectors. Now, before we get going and to keep you safe, I'd just like to confirm there will be no fire alarms. So if you do hear the fire alarm, it's genuine, so please get up and move to the nearest exit as safely as you can. We're recording the event and that's why the speakers have microphones for the recording. They do not work for amplification in the room, so if anyone is hard of hearing, we've got some seats down for you at the front, so please do feel free to get up and move. Now I'd like to introduce the speakers. I know many of you will know Mark if you've been to previous events. Mark Diffley has been a researcher and he has over 20 years, there's quite a few more though over now I think, Mark, isn't it? Delivering research and insights for clients across the public, private and third sectors in Scotland and even further afield. And Mari Spowage is also a friend of the Institute. We've had her many times speaking before, Director of the Fraser of Allender Institute at the University of Strathclyde. And I'm really grateful to you for hot-footing it back from Aberdeen today, and even more grateful that ScotRail worked and that you're here. Previously, Mari was Deputy Chief Executive of the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Head of the National Accounts in the Scottish Government. She has over a decade of experience working in different areas of statistics and analysis. And Mari will be followed by Sean Sabat, who I'm delighted is joining us today for the first time. But he's not going to get away because I think he's really interesting. And Sean is going to do the so what. So we can collect tons of data and statistics, but it's the so what that's important. And Sean is working at the hot end of trying to get people into jobs in Scotland. And I think that's the so what for me of the data in this survey. So we're relying on you to share your insights really openly. It's not Chatham House, this room. So be careful if you say we have got some journalists in the room. If there's anything that you don't want to be public, then think carefully about how you phrase it. But don't be a stranger when we get to the questions, because we do think the audience is as much part of this event as the speakers up here. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark. Oh, I didn't tell you it's Sean. I got so distracted by... Sean is Director of Brightwork, which is an established multi-sector recruitment agency. He's also the founder of Scotland Against Modern Slavery and a board member of the Refugee Survival Trust and an advisory committee member of Show Racism and the Red Card. So he's got lots of experience to draw on that's relevant for the conversation today. So Mark will speak for around 10 minutes and then we'll hand over to Mari and Sean for their reflections on the data, and then we'll hand it over to the audience for your reflections, your questions, or anything that the research makes you think about. So Mari and Sean are going to move to the seats at the front just so they're not blocking your view, and they also get to see the data. So over to you, Mark.
Good afternoon. Nice to see a few, lots of familiar faces and a few new ones as well. I think, as Susan says, this is very much an audience discussion, not least because what I have to say is so gloomy that you'll want me to sit down probably as soon as possible. That will come as no surprise to anyone. But rather, I think that rather than pitching it just as a tablet of doom and gloom and we're all kind of going to hell in a handcart, I think what I'd quite like to frame it, I mean, there is actually, that's inescapable, right? And when you see the numbers come up on the screen, you'll see why. But actually, what the spirit of this, as much as kind of reporting this of interest, which is really important, is to think about, well, what do we do about this? This tells us actually not just about what the mood of the nation is right now, but it also tells us about what people are expecting, how they're expecting to behave, what they're expecting to spend their money on and so on in the future. So if, like me, you run a business, or if you're in politics, if you're in policy-making, government, this hopefully is helpful to try and see what may be coming down the road. And that's the spirit, I think, in which, as well as reporting the doom and gloom, I would like this to be received. A little bit about the survey. We're delighted, as we are every quarter, to be working with Susan and Sheila and Tom, as part of Susan's team, who are extremely supportive of us in producing this work. It's a relatively large-scale survey, so we get over 2,000 responses, which for a Scotland-only survey is pretty big. That enables us to do lots of different types of analysis, some of which you'll see a bit later on. It enables us to really sort of dig in to the data. We're also grateful to our colleagues at Charlotte Street Partners for their help in getting this presentation and the report ready. So a cast of many. Before I sort of start looking at the economic numbers in a bit more detail, I wanted to just flag up something which I think is really important for the wider discussion, but not directly related but not directly related to the rest of the presentation. Because we also ask what people's priorities are over time, and it won't be any surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to the news and the fact that obviously, as you can tell just walking here, today winter is on its way, if not actually having arrived, that actually what we see now, having the economy and particularly the cost of living and inflation really having dominated people's concerns over the majority of this year, we now see increasing concern in the public about the NHS. And as we get to the cusp of the winter and into proper winter, I suspect when we next do the survey, that may well be even higher. So contextually, I think that's something to really, really bear in mind. As far as the figures on the economy are concerned, and this is the bit where you kind of have to strap in and get through the pain somewhat. We ask 4 questions here. We ask people's views about the economy now as in a static point. How do you feel about the economy now as compared to a year ago? And then how do you feel about your personal finances now compared to a year ago? And then we ask about the future. So what's your view about how the economy will change in the future? Will it get better or worse in the next 12 months? And the same with your personal finances. And the charts you see there are a summary position of that data. What's really interesting, of course, is that the darker shades here are people telling us that things are either worse than they were last year or going to get worse in the year to come, both in terms of their own personal finances and the economy as a whole. And it's the dark shades that really dominate both of these, all 4 of these charts. So, for example, if we look on the top left, 94%. Now you did hear that right. 94% tell us that the economy is in a worse shape. The general economic conditions, as we phrase it in the question, are in a worse shape than they were 12 years ago. Now, that's... Months, not years. Sorry, did I say years? Sorry, 12 months ago, or 1 year ago, yeah. And you can see the pattern develop. These are pretty stark numbers, and actually they are quite a bit worse in some cases than we have seen in the past. But one of the themes of my kind of opening remarks here are that these attitudes, these views are not expressed evenly throughout the population. And it won't, I suspect, surprise anyone in the room to hear that in most of these cases, in fact all of these cases, you're more likely to feel negatively either about current economic conditions, current personal finances, or the future if you're older, if you live in one of Scotland's more deprived neighbourhoods as measured by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, and in many cases if you're a parent. And that's something that's really sort of jumped out at us in this quarter, which hadn't been as apparent in previous quarters. A lot of these numbers, and I won't go into each one because we'd be here all day, but for a lot of these, and the numbers are all available for those who are interested, households with children are in a worse position than households without children. Okay, so the effects of this are really being felt by older people in the more deprived neighbourhoods, and in many cases by parents. And if we look over time, so this I think is really interesting, right? So the four numbers that you've just seen, or the 4 charts you've just seen on the previous slide, are now expressed in a time series, right? From a year ago, just over a year ago, to now. Now, the orange and the light blue line that you can see at the bottom there, they express the current situation. So this is the net, these are net figures. So this is the number who are saying things are getting better minus the number who are saying that things are getting worse, which is why they're all expressed negatively. So what you can see is a couple of things, I think. One is that when we ask about the current position, so how do you feel now compared to 12 months ago, we continue to see the numbers fall away. So they're down to 91%, as I mentioned a minute ago, when we ask about economic conditions, and minus 60% when we ask about people's personal finances. When we ask about the future, so the next 12 months, we see this is the tiny bit of good news, but I can hardly go as far as to say that. We've seen a marginal, and it is very marginal, and statistically it's really almost negligible, but it is there, upward turn. So there's been a slight improvement where people saying about the next, people talking about the next 12 months. Now these are still heavily in the negative territory, but they are, we'll see whether that's a trend that continues. We'll see. I have some doubts about that, but we can discuss that later on. The other thing I think which is really interesting is that the real steady fall here happened at the beginning of the year. This hasn't happened recently. This hasn't even happened, I would say, as necessarily as a result of, let's say, the budget that got canned down south. This was happening throughout the year, but the biggest drops were actually at the beginning of the year. And again, that's something which some may find surprising, but I do think it's worth pointing out. So that's the trend over time, over the last year. We ask, some really interesting stuff here about income levels. So we ask a series of questions about your level of income, broadly how satisfied you are with it, which you won't be surprised to hear more people are dissatisfied than are satisfied, but also the extent to which it covers your the cost of living, your ability to meet your household bills, and any paid or unpaid commitments that you have. And this summarises what we, as a static position now, where those numbers are. But again, this 48% that we see here, overall people are dissatisfied. Sorry, I'm reading at the wrong end. The levels are dissatisfied with their, no I'm not, I'm at the right end. The 48% are dissatisfied with their income. It's much higher for parents, it's much for people with children in the household, and it's much higher for those who live in the most deprived neighbourhoods. And again, this is how this has changed, these measures have changed over time in the last year. So you can see in the vast majority of cases there has been, again, a very, very sharp drop-off at the beginning of the year. That seems to be where the numbers, that seems to be the point of change, the beginning of this year, the early months of this year, rather than more recently. Of course, there is an argument that once things go really badly, they can't get a whole lot worse, right? But it is really interesting that this is not a more recent phenomenon. Okay, and again, we can see how income adequacy, in this case, the extent to which it covers your cost of living, differs between different SIMD quintiles. So what we've done here, we asked people on a scale of 1 to 5 how satisfied they are with their income covering their cost of living. A lower score is dissatisfaction, a higher score is satisfaction. You can see how for all income groups, for all SIMD quintiles, they all started a bit above the halfway point, so above 2.5. Those in the most deprived neighbourhoods are now well under that, right? Although there has, and this is an interesting point, in the most deprived neighbourhoods there's been a slight uptick, and that may be due to things like the help that's been given around energy bills and so forth. We can't say that categorically, but that's my suspicion there. But again, we see a really, really sharp drop-off here at the beginning of the year. So, what are people doing about the cost of living crisis? And I think what we try and do here is measure a number of things. One is the more obvious kind of financial impacts and toll that it's taken. So do you not switch your heating on? Do you cut down on certain cultural or leisure activities and so forth? But also we try and measure other impacts as well. So impacts on mental health around anxiety. So this may be a little bit difficult to read every one of these here, but I'll give you a few of the highlights, or highlights, not maybe the right word to use. So as you can see at the top, 68% of people, so over 2/3, tell us that they have avoided putting their heating on when they otherwise would have done so. So in other words, they've avoided putting their heating on for financial reasons because they can't afford it. And that's up by 14 percentage points from August. Obviously there are seasonal factors at play here, but nonetheless, that's gone up sharply. Now, if you're over 55, that's 74%. If you're in SIMD quintiles 1 to 3, it's on average 72%. If you're retired, it's 71%. Okay, so again, you can see the pattern here about the unevenness of the impact of the crisis. Almost the same number have cut down on non-essential purchases, 67%. If you're in a household with children, that's 73%. So again, those with children really suffering more in some aspects. We look at, you can see about a quarter of us report that we've lost sleep due to anxiety, which is the 24% there. Again, households with children, that's 35%. And if you're in the SIMD1, which is the most deprived quintile, it's 32%. Okay, I could go on, but you get the idea. And these uneven patterns are apparent throughout the data, I'm afraid to say. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of my opening remarks. A couple of additional things that I just wanted to highlight, and I think this is really important. We ask people about their spending intentions in the next 12 months. Now, although this chart shows a big upswing, actually that's a little bit misleading, because that's what it is that's a proportion of people who tell us they're going to spend less on each of the items that you can see listed. So 62% tell us they're going to spend less on restaurants or staying at hotels. 58% tell us they're going to spend less on leisure and culture, and 48% on clothing and footwear. So if you run a business in any, or you work in any of these sectors, then this is a real kind of red flag, I think, about what possibly you might expect over the next 12 months. Of course, predictions in polling are traditionally not always, don't always come exactly true. But nonetheless, I would say both intuitively and I think, comparing things to last time as well, I think this does kind of make sense. And I think the priorities here, the order in which we're listing things here does make sense. So potentially, in some industries, there is going to be a really significant hit in the amount of consumer spending that's going to happen. Okay, so the final thing that I just wanted to talk about was, as well as measuring people's current view on the economy and their future view, whether in terms of their own finances or what they intend to be spending, we ask a question around whether people think the economy works for them or not, or for who they think the economy works. And you can see here, the vast majority of us do not think the economy works in the interests of most people. Now, that may be unsurprising. I'm not sure how I would answer that question should it be posed. I think in the current climate, that's probably not that surprising. But actually, 82% of people do not think the economy works in the interests of most people, and only 6% of people do. Now, I think that tells us something, when we can talk about this, a bit more underlying. This is a bit of a more underlying indicator than, an absolute kind of, well, what are people thinking at the moment? But it's something that we're going to keep a pretty close eye on. And about 80% of people tell us they think the economy works primarily in the interests of wealthy people, which is the chart at the bottom right there. So we'll be asking that question again, and we'll be seeking a trend on that question that question too. That's the end of my lecture of gloom, I'm afraid. It is pretty gloomy. As I said at the beginning, I'm trying to frame it as much about, well, what's coming down the track and how can we prepare for this, as well as to report, importantly, what is actually happening at the moment. But with that, I'll hand back, Susan, to you.
Fantastic. And I'll just ask Mary and Shal to take their seats at the front again. Over to you, Mary.
Yeah, when I was reading the material, it is hard to find the positives in it. But it chimes very much with what we find. We do a quarterly business survey. And one of the really interesting things, I think, is how well the messages coming from that are chiming with what citizens are saying. That's not surprising, perhaps. Businesses are, after all, made up of people. But in terms of expectations for new business over the next year versus performance over the last few months, and how people are feeling about their personal finances, it's very much chiming with what we're hearing from businesses as well, that generally businesses are quite pessimistic about the year to come and what it might mean for them. Quite a lot of them have seen supply chain difficulties start to ease a little, which was one ray of hope, sort of the post-COVID supply chain issues starting to ease. But all we were hearing was real difficulty hiring and getting the staff they need at the same time as really pulling back on looking to hire because they were worried about the situation to come. And we are in this strange situation in the labour market, of course, where it's so tight. Nobody can find the people that they need, but everybody's worried about what's going to happen next and perhaps an increase in joblessness over the next year or so. Really interesting to hear about the differences by area and deprivation. We've done a lot of kind of macro analysis on the inflation experience of different sorts of households, i.e. those at the lower end on income are experiencing the highest level of inflation whilst attracting the lowest level of wage growth. So you talk about these sort of macro indicators, and this brings it down to the sorts of choices people are having to make in the most deprived households, and those are the ones that are seeing the biggest price rises with the least amount of wage increases to help them deal with that. Really good point about the fact that people have felt this for quite a number of months now. And it does really come back to not just this, but a lot of it's about energy prices. And we have to remember, of course, that people's energy bills really started to rocket in October 2021. And you can see that in the charts that you're looking at. Now, it's not just that. Rental prices, rents have been going up hugely as well over the last year. But you can see that in your data, I think, and that's what it's reflecting, is how much more people are having to spend on energy bills, despite the caps that are in place. They've still gone up hugely, and let's not forget that prices at the moment are double what they were this time last year. One other thing I'd like to pick up, which was mentioned in the press release, but you didn't pick out specifically, is the really concerning statistic about the reduction in donations to charities. The charitable sector, just like businesses, has had some help with energy prices of late, but over the last year or so, they've not had the caps that domestic customers have had. And we're hearing some pretty worrying things about charitable services that are run at the moment, having huge increases in their energy bills. And there is no sign at the moment for help post-March it says, the government says businesses, but that means also charitable organisations who are not at the moment anyway going to have any help. And if at the same time their income is falling by 40% or 40% of people are reducing their donations to charities, then that's a really potential big crisis point coming down the road, especially given the increasing reliance that government is putting on third sector organisations delivering services. So that really concerns me from a policy point of view, what that means for our third sector and its ability to sort of continue to deliver services post the end of March, when their energy bills might skyrocket again. So, yeah, that's also gloomy, but it was pretty stark reading it.
Thanks, Mary.
I think I'm just going to watch Tom and Jerry now for the rest of the afternoon. I was actually saying earlier on, I find the news so difficult to watch. Sometimes I do watch Tom and Jerry for 10 or 15 minutes before bed just to clear my mind of how difficult it is out there. And unfortunately, Mark, you're right. This does paint a really gloomy and sad picture. I'll probably talk from the three different hats that I wear and kind of interweave them all, if that's okay. So as Susan mentioned, I'm a director of a recruitment business. It's ingrained in the drinks and food manufacturing sector as well as the public sector in Scotland. And we saw post-Brexit the biggest drop of EU nationals leave our workforce that we'd ever seen before, 10%, 450 workers a month from January 2021 up until the summer. And these people went home and they didn't come back. And then we saw the panic in the market, in the labour market, about how do we fill those gaps. We have a huge gap left in certain sectors, not in the drinks industry, because that tended to be UK nationals that worked there, but in the food distribution and other sectors, agriculture, care and hospitality. I'm sure you're all more than aware. Those roles have not been able to be filled, but what you have seen, and just, following the news today and kind of touching on some of the things you talked about people, 17% of people will be looking for additional work or additional income. We've seen, firstly, those businesses that were so reliant on migrant labour were not prepared. They were so far behind it. Now, we could see this coming for years, but they thought something was going to give, and they didn't. And they panicked. And that panic created a better atmosphere, I think. That panic made them respect the workers a little bit more. There wasn't a hire and fire culture. The pay rates started to increase. The working culture was better. And those businesses that didn't join and didn't move quickly have been left behind. And I have to say, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because that was the quick fix of cheap and plentiful labour. That's over now. And the acceptance that UK nationals or other skilled migration is the way around. So, touching back on what Mark had said, about 17% of people will be looking for additional income, we've seen that jump really, really quickly in the recent months. I'm fast forwarding now, and that's really scary. And the amount of questions and calls that we get about, do we offer cash in hand work? Now, obviously we don't. The amount of people that will take a second job, people that won't declare a first job and take a second job, they will be working weekends. We've had actually our first instance of somebody collapse because they're overworked, but we didn't know because they had the this was their secondary income. As a father with 3 children, I'm a father with 3 children, and it struck a chord with me. So we're seeing that jump statistically as well. We're seeing a higher percentage of people looking for second jobs than we've ever seen before, which is frightening. We're also seeing, to tie in with this, is that somebody may have commuted a bit further for work. They'll take a lower pay rate now to get something closer to home. They also need family-friendly working environments, because juggling childcare or having a child in nursery that they pay for isn't viable anymore. So there's a shift system at home where the parents are juggling around work. So we're seeing that type of request coming in, and that is all new. That has happened in the last 3 months. And sorry to add to a little bit more of the doom and gloom. We've had a bit of insight into where, it just really ties into what Mark said about our intentions of not going out as much. Hospitality is going to be hit. We've had some insight into where the potential closures of businesses will be, from credit insurers, it's construction, and it's hospitality. So it really does tie in. That leads me to the next part, is that Mary had mentioned that we will see, because we're going into recession, there will be job losses, there will be availability of labour in the market. But I fear that the type of work that we're trying to plug the gaps, those businesses that I talked about earlier on that didn't change their culture, that didn't move on, that I was thinking they would have to move quickly, they could plug their gaps with those people that are out of work, that are desperate. And that isn't good work. I think what we now know what the definition of what good work is. It's about hours, it's about pay rate, it's about culture, it's about treatment. And that's really, really important. And for me, in our business anyway, who we partner with, that is really, really important. And I did say I'd weave this into some other areas. So, in my role with Scotland Against Modern Slavery, now this is a Scottish Government mandated organisation that, we help run and raise awareness of the issue of human trafficking. Sadly, we've seen a rapid increase in the amount of labour exploitation that's happening across Scotland in every local authority. We've seen, if I just quickly, statistics-wise, pre-COVID, 512 victims were rescued. We're looking at 1,000 already for this year alone. Now, it's connected, because if you're being exploited by the nature of taking I keep pointing at your presentation, but undocumented work is a form of exploitation, whether you like it or not. If you go into Gumtree or Facebook, take a look at cash in hand work, or job plus transport plus accommodation, and these are the frightening visual things that we're seeing, but we're also hearing about it now from the victims that are rescued on the ground. And actually, sadly to say, the streets of Edinburgh give a little bit of a higher indication, because if you run away from an exploitative situation in Scotland, you more than likely end up in the streets of Edinburgh, and that's where the charities that we work with are picking this up. And finally, I'll say, so we do see, I was going to get a bit darker as well, but I don't want to leave it too late. But when I was at the Scottish Chamber of Commerce annual dinner last week, and the Deputy Chief Exec used the phrase permacrisis, you know, this new word that's in the dictionary. We're living through new times where just don't, you know, this is the way it's always going to be. There's always going to be something. And what she advised is don't batten down the hatches from a business perspective, because many businesses are. They're really concerned, and they're telling us that they're looking at their hiring plans and making adjustments because they don't know where it's going to be. The supply chain issues that Mary touched on, in some sectors, they look to continue, depending on how reliant they were on much further flung destinations or more volatile nations. So, but what she said is, kind of rang through with 650 businesses there, and not one person I met didn't disagree with this. Now's not the time to batten down the hatches. Now is the time to try and take some risk, because this isn't going to change. This is the way the world is just now. This is the new economy. So what adaptations can that be, and how will your business adapt? And the one thing I've taken from that is that there's many more businesses out there now in the sectors that we work in and out with those sectors that are willing to do a lot more good and support those communities that are at risk. Not just write a cheque for charity, but do more work to raise their profile. And I don't just mean the tick box ESG type of stuff that we sometimes see in many areas of the business community. Genuinely, they see the suffering that was highlighted there from your presentation, Mark, that they need to do something more. So simple things that many businesses would have a canteen, and they've either completely subsidised it or made one free meal a day. Now, this would have been unheard of a few years ago, but actually that becomes vital to the workforce. Or actually looking at the working shift pattern and saying, well, how can we help you? Because, to be brutal, retention is the new recruitment. If you can keep your workforce, you don't need to go through the pain barrier and trying to fill those gaps. So how can you keep the workers? So there's a lot more care out there than I would have seen before. I'm not saying it's all fixed. And I suppose as well, I cannot leave this room without talking about the Refugee Survival Trust and the right to work. So what we see is the exploitation of those that are in the asylum system, and I know it's very topical just now, but we see it in Glasgow, we see it in Edinburgh, and particularly in Glasgow, is that for £40 a week and £4.50 for a bus fare to travel around Glasgow a day, you will take undocumented work. You will take something that's exploitative whilst waiting for a decision from the Home Office. There's not one asylum seeker that I've met through the course of the work that we do that does not want to work. They're desperate to work, but that desperation for them to work takes them into that other arena of undocumented illegal working. And if they do get a positive decision, they don't come into the workforce, so we've lost them. And potentially we're still paying. So for me, there's a real point here about those 120 to 140,000, depending on how you look at the statistics, across the UK. But could we let them work straight away? And if they don't get a positive decision, we understand, but could we give them that first chance? So I hope that covers some of the points that were brought up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. Right, I'm going to open it up to the audience. I think I spied Luciano, so I'm going to give the FT a mention and then come to Sean. There was an article in the FT yesterday, and it was very much looking at the things that you've just mentioned around employers giving much more holistic care around employees now. It's kind of something they used to do in the olden days, because you did used to get, when I first started, I worked on a conveyor belt in my holidays from university, packing aircraft meals, and you did get fed free then, which was one of the reasons I took the job. And then they took that away. So the next summer I didn't get fed free. And it was a real different feeling in the organisation. So I think that stuff's coming back. But the kind of payday loans that some organisations are doing, so that you can now borrow ahead of your salary, and preferential mortgage rates and things that was being talked about in the FT article. But is that, so it's great for the people that are benefiting, but does that make a bigger difference between people that are employed and people that are operating in a self-employed or casual gig labour, because the gap becomes bigger, so they don't get the rates on buying, they're more exposed to loan sharks or that kind of thing?
Absolutely, so I think you're 100% right. I see that the change in the business when I'm being really general, is probably being driven by doing the right thing, but also they want to keep their staff. You know, it's like remote working. If you speak to anyone in business that has office working, if they've come down hard on making you come into the office versus anything else, they know they're going to lose a significant amount of their workforce, so they've fallen in the middle for now. So I think there's a lot more adaptability there. It's going in the right direction for the right reasons, I think. It needs to go much further.
Brilliant. Thanks. Right, out to the audience, unless there's anything the panel wants to reflect on anything anyone said. Right, we'll hand up for questions then. Who wants to go first? Oh, fantastic, Murdo.
Okay, thanks. Murdo Fraser, MSP. Mark, going back to your numbers, I mean, you pointed out there's been a very stark fall in confidence as from the early part of this year. Now, is that not just directly related to Ukraine and the impact that's had on energy markets, which is, you know, trickled through to household costs? And is the consequence of that, therefore, not if suddenly we saw either a resolution in Ukraine or energy costs returning to some degree of normality, because there is some thought that, you know, long-term gas prices are coming down? Do you think that would make a big difference in improving the outlook for households?
Well, it's a very good question, and what we can show is the timeline, right? Which, Murdo, I think is what you've picked up on, and then, you know, tried to think, well, what was going on at that point, which might explain that. Now, to be clear, I can't say that with any absolute certainty because we don't ask, frankly, right? But I think it's absolutely fair enough to say that what was going on at that time, I mean, something happened in that period, right? And that was one of the things that was really happening in that period. When was the invasion? Was February, was it? February, beginning of March, whatever. So, yeah, the timeline would stack up there. That's the period where we saw things really, really dramatically falling away in terms of confidence. And, you know, if you look at, you know, inflation and bills over that period, that's when they went up hugely as well. I suppose the point I made is that, I mean, if you look at the trend, you know, once it gets to a certain really low level, you then don't have a lot further down to actually go. So you wouldn't, you just, it's not possible to keep seeing the same amount of dramatic fall off, survey after survey. But it has continued to fall, albeit less dramatically. And I'm absolutely sure that if and as when, you'll know more about this than me, inflation starts to level off and come down, and depending on what further assistance there is with bills and energy bills coming down, that we will start to see that gradually upticking. You know, for what it's worth, I don't think that's going to be. I don't think the increase back up is going to be as sharp as the fall down was, and history will tell us. I mean, the sort of go-to example here, and we were talking about this in a previous event, was the 08-09 recession. Now, levels of pessimism are actually lower now, or sorry, to be accurate, levels of pessimism are higher now than they were then. So we're even more pessimistic now than we were then. And actually, although that was a completely different type of economic and financial event, it took many years for that curve. So it went down like this, but it went, you know, in a U shape around a very, very long kind of recovery back through. And I suspect that's what we'll see rather than a very dramatic upswing again.
Can I just add as well, you know, the invasion of Ukraine was a big part of it, and it certainly was the driver for huge increases in oil prices. But we have to remember that gas prices were increasing all the way through 2021 as the economies emerged from COVID, and economies around the world started looking to move away from coal and onto gas. And there were lots of different events that happened during 2021 to push up the gas price. But that was already sort of happening, and I think we can't forget that even if things are resolved in Ukraine and Russian gas is available again, say, on the markets, so it pushes the price down a bit, you know, in the more medium term, I think we're still going to have these issues. There's just not enough gas for the demand. So I think the prices are likely to remain high for gas, which I suppose in the sort of thinking about the different parts of the energy trilemma and the price and the access and all of these other things and energy security, I think there's likely to be still this push for obviously moving away and decarbonising our economies for climate change reasons as well as for security reasons. So, you know, gas already had increased hugely before the invasion. And I don't know, for me, it seemed to be about that big increase in the autumn of 2021, as well as obviously these wider geopolitical factors making people feel less secure. Hugely driving food inflation, of course, which is definitely because of the war. But there are also other factors of domestically generated inflation because of our labour market as well. So there's lots of things going on, but we can't forget how much gas prices had increased before the war.
Yeah, and I suppose exactly. I suppose the final thing to point out is that the starting point here, if we say the starting point, well, for the sake of argument, just because it was the first time we did the survey, was a year ago. I mean, we started in a fairly gloomy place then, right? So I think the difference between now and let's say 12, 13, 14 years ago, whenever it was, that with optimism was, it's never sky high, but it was certainly in a better place, or a more optimistic place, when that crisis happened than when this crisis happened, which makes this one look, I think, probably even more dramatic in some ways. So even though I look back and showed it earlier, you know, the net scores on things like economic optimism or the optimism around your financial circumstances were, in some cases, already fairly embedded in the negative column before the crisis, when they really did kind of hit rock bottom as we see now.
Who else would like to ask anything? So, sorry.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, my name's Bill Fee. Just a concerned pensioner. A two-part question, if I can. The way that this whole financial situation at the moment is reported, it's the 50 billion black hole, etc., which is an insult to black holes, because black holes are all consuming, and 50 billion is 2.5% of our GDP. It's, you know, so how much is the way it's been reported driving people's opinion and affecting their confidence? And the second part of the question relating to gas prices, my energy supplier tells me it's 100% green energy, but they're charging an awful lot of money for it. And the reason is the price of electricity is fixed to gas, so unfix it. How hard can it be?
So I'll take the second one first. I think that's what the UK government are looking to do with the review of the energy market, because at the moment the price of electricity is fixed to that marginal unit you can generate when you want to, and the way we do that at the moment is through using gas. So the UK government in its autumn statement last week obviously announced quite a lot of investment in nuclear, which obviously has mixed people have mixed views about that, but that's another way to generate that demand-led, so you can generate electricity when you want. And obviously that's the challenge for renewable sources, is to move to that sort of how do we ensure that we have what we want when we want it rather than when it can be generated. And that is the big challenge. So I think that's from what my reading of what the energy market review that they're doing, is how to decouple that electricity price from gas prices, given the amount of green energy that's been generated. And I think particularly when you're living in somewhere like, I don't know, Orkney, and you're generating, you know, all you can see is wind turbines everywhere, but you're paying more for your electricity than people on the mainland because of an antiquated transmission charging mechanism, then, you know, people are pretty cross about that, and so they should be. And part of the sort of transition to decarbonise our economy will be to sort of decentralise that energy system, so that people are more likely to be able to pay cheaper prices because they're generating it on their doorstep. So that is a problem, and you know, there's a lot of people who do not are frustrated by exactly the situation you've outlined. This is 100% green, and it's been generated just there. So why am I paying something which is linked to the gas price?
I think in answer to your first question, I think is probably quite a lot. You know, the way in which something's reported contributing to anxiety. I think it's probably a lot. I mean, I put the slide up at the beginning around, concern about the NHS now slowly rising. Now, I can't unpick that. I can tell you who's feeling that concern, and attempted to do that when I was talking. What I can't tell you is exactly why that's gone up, but we can certainly, and I think I said in my remarks, the most intuitive two explanations will be that obviously winter is coming, so people are starting to get concerned, because that's traditionally when the NHS will suffer most of its problems. But you'd have to be living under a stone not to have seen quite a bit of coverage both here in Scotland and elsewhere about the challenges that the NHS is facing. So I would say it kind of would almost go without saying that some of that will feed through into people's concerns. So some of it will be lived experience, some of it will be what they're picking up, what they're hearing from members of their community or members of their family. Virtually everyone will know someone who is, waiting to be seen, or is, being delayed more than they would like. So there are a mixture of things going in, but I think you're right. How it's reported, the extent to which it's reported, how often, will absolutely contribute. And surveys, of course, remember, are done at a point in time. And that point in time, whether we like it or not, will be not necessarily instrumental, but will play a part in the data that we show, for sure.
One of the numbers you've got is the number of people that are borrowing money from family and friends. So obviously that kind of shows the fragility in the system.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry, Sean, you were going to say something.
Just kind of to back up the evidence there from a business perspective, the business community bases its decisions on what's happening politically around it. It's been so hard to make those decisions longer term, and I think it goes back to, you mentioned 2008, 2009, and the lack of confidence in the economy. It drove business decisions and hiring plans. We're seeing a similar pattern after what we look as kind of high growth in hiring over the course of this year. It looks like it's going to decline potentially as we go into next year, and these guys are far more qualified than me. And the political instability that we've seen as well in the UK is, between both governments, the Scottish Government and the UK Government, is integral to all of this as well, because if you don't know where the decisions are and how stable our governments are, and ideologically both are opposed to each other, it seems to be at most times, we just don't know how a business can make a decision looking far enough into the future. So it kind of backs up a lot of the feeling that you've said yourself from the survey.
Just to add, whenever I see anything about fiscal black holes or whatever, it absolutely drives me mad as somebody who analyses these things, because it's always, compared to what? And the one that was described prior to the autumn statement, a lot of that was about laying the ground for how terrible this was going to be. So when it was just quite bad, everybody felt like it was okay. And it was the spending restraint or cuts, however you want to put it, that were laid out are all delayed to the fourth and fifth year of the forecast, and they're compared to previous plans that had been laid out. They're not actual cuts in cash terms, and I don't think it's a helpful way of describing things to use words like black hole when you're talking about these the public finances. But the government, like you said, doesn't just have levers of monetary and fiscal policy to help steady the ship and to give more economic confidence. The signalling point is really important as well. So political instability does not help businesses or individuals feel confident about their situation. So I would agree with that.
Thank you. It's Claire Baker, MSP. I was interested in the public perceptions, and you said it was people in deprived communities, older people and parents, and you seem to be surprised that it was parents. You would think it would be parents because you have additional responsibilities in the household, but is that a new feature? And if we're thinking about parents as well, should government not be focused on policies to support that? Because if you think about the tightening labour market, that's a whole pool of people who are maybe being put off going to work because of childcare costs or other factors. But I'm interested in why they feel more negative, and you're surprised by the negativity or pessimism that's coming from that group.
Okay, so I suppose if I express surprise, I probably shouldn't have. I'm surprised because the last time we did the survey, which was in the summer, August, I think, we didn't see this as a feature to the extent that we do now. Now, I'm certainly not saying for every measure. You need to look at the data, and I can certainly send it to you. But what's striking is that for a lot of these measures, by no means all of them, but for a lot of them, parents stand out. So when I look at data, there are kind of red flags on it. This is basically someone, this is really important. It's really important. And when I look through the data that parents have given us, as in households with one or more children, you start to see that appearing quite a lot. The real red flags that I noticed, I put a slide up earlier, which was around the impact of the cost of living crisis, and I'm not sure I mentioned in my remarks, but I'll do so now if I didn't, because I realised I was running relatively short on time. But there were two things in there, one of which I think I did flag, which was anxiety. So respondents with children are much more likely to be losing sleep over this. Now, that's pretty significant, right? 24% of all respondents, 35% of respondents with children. The other thing flagging up, because I was running out of time, there's a question we ask about whether you're cutting down on meals or on portion sizes to save money. And 22% of people tell us that they're doing that. And it's 28% if you've got kids. Now, if you're doing it yourself, that may or may not also be, you may not be, but also you may be doing that for your children as well. When we look at spending, a lot of spending in the future, particularly on things like clothing and footwear, parents in particular are telling us they're cutting back on that. Will that include things like school uniforms, school equipment type thing? I don't know, can't say for sure. But so I am not necessarily surprised by that, but I'm quite struck by it. I'm struck by the way it didn't appear to the same extent in the summer, and the way it appears as a feature through quite a lot of the survey, which I think is why in events like this it's worth mentioning.
Can I add as well, I imagine if someone from the Scottish Government was here, they'd mention the child payment at this point, the Scottish child payment, which is, obviously been increased quite a lot recently, and now is being targeted at all children with households who are receiving certain means-tested benefits of £25 per week per child.
I was going to ask, do you find it is just parents in more deprived families, or is it parents across the board?
Well, not entirely, but it is more likely to be parents in more deprived communities, but it's not. I have to say it's not entirely.
But just to add that, that's obviously for those who are entitled to means-tested benefits. So those that are just out of that eligibility, and the anecdotal feedback from charities who help families in crisis is that it's people who generally haven't had to ask for help from food banks and other sort of interventions like that before, who are not maybe in the system. I don't know how to be referred for things like food banks and these sorts of things, who are now presenting for help. So that's the concern. There is that targeted money for those people who are entitled to those benefits, which is great for them. But it's that cohort just slightly above that, maybe who might now be in crisis.
Yeah, and I think what we're saying is just it's something it's a flag at this point for the reasons that I suggested earlier, rather than setting lots of hairs running. But it is important.
I've got questions backing up here, so we'll take them in quick succession.
One of the things that I enjoy about attending events such as this is actually to explore things that we can do to resolve matters. And one of the most depressing things, I think, from the reaction to the autumn statement was the fact that there was a conspiracy of silence amongst the politicians and the so-called experts as to whether, on the question of taxation, Scottish taxation, and that the Scottish budget was basically fixed. Now, that is a myth. The Scotland Act provides the Scottish Parliament with powers to vary and change taxation and introduce taxation. to a fairly significant extent, actually. But they all seem to go or try and justify their position on the matter of no detriment. Now, as far as I can see, this no detriment is based on the fact that we have a block grant and Barnett consequentials. Why has no one actually thought, let's get rid of the Barnett consequentials and the block grant and use the powers that the Scottish Parliament has to raise all the public funding that we need in Scotland to address the problem? Because from my calculations, we could have a universal citizen's income of about £10,000 a year for every man, woman and child in this country, and we could fund it from a model of annual ground rent. There's no reason why we couldn't do that. And about 99% of the people in this country would be better off. And the source of that funding actually comes from dilapidated and vacant land, largely in urban Scotland, which has been lying empty and doing nothing and contributing nothing for generations. And according to the Land Commission, 60% of that land and dilapidated property is in the public sector. So that if all owners of land and property were obliged to pay, then they would soon get rid of their land, give it away, rather than having the liability of paying it.
Thanks. I'll just group the questions, if that's all right.
I'm Ken Ross. I'm involved in business. And just some observations on the points you made. And thank you for the information. Incredibly helpful. But the downturn starting at the turn of the year, can I make perhaps a suggestion that might have come about because of the increasing uncertainty and the increasing detachment of Westminster from the electorate and actually from reality as well. What the government did was created uncertainty and instability. And these kind of emotions prevail throughout the whole country. And even children are affected by it and are becoming anxious over such uncertainty and instability. And the politicians who are present here should take note of this, that as we go down this road, we don't want to hear fine words from them. We actually want to see some actions. We want to see things being delivered. It's sad that the prevailing attitudes in government are to regulate, control, delay and frustrate, not to encourage and facilitate investment or activity. Regulate, control, delay and frustrate. These things are prevailing in industry at present. We had recently the nonsense of the Housing Minister in Scotland announcing a rent freeze. And that signalled to the investors who wish to invest in delivering affordable housing in Scotland that you're not welcome, because you're not going to get any growth in your income, although your costs are going to go up. Now, what do you expect the investors are going to do? They're going to run away so fast it's not true. And as a consequence, there is over £1 billion worth of activity on hold at present. Now, one of the unintended consequences, which is quite positive in actual fact, is because of that, the RICS just recently announced that the last quarter activity was down 39%. And as a consequence, building cost inflation has somewhat levelled off. It wasn't intended, but is an unintended consequence. But the one thing that we need, and it's good to see, we've actually got adults in Downing Street now, and its boring is good, because the country actually needs some stability. Because I think for a period of time, we've all watched in horror what's been going on down there, and the detachment from reality. And there's an obligation on politicians to govern and give us some hope and have a culture where you actively encourage and facilitate sustainable economic growth. Thanks.
Just go straight down here.
Yeah, sorry, my name's Marina Scott. I've never been to this before. I'm more or less a punter off the street. Couple of comments. it's no wonder that only 6% of people think that the economy is working for them when, as this gentleman pointed out, we now discover that electricity prices are linked to the gas prices. Why? Why do they have to, have meetings about it? Why can't they just change it? I don't feel that anybody's working for me. I also have 2 young children, 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. And the politician Claire was over there, and you're asking, why are parents so worried? Mortgages. None of you have, well, you're just beginning to mention housing now. I have a 6-figure income, actually, in my household. I'm not at all from a deprived area, but we are terrified what's going to happen if we have to move from our 1.49% mortgage to 7.5% or whatever it might be next year. We're talking thousands of pounds. Taxes are going up. Like obviously we don't get any child credits. We don't get any credits for anything. I guess we're the squeezed middle, and it is actually terrifying. And I think of Liz Truss disastrous, as I call her, and Kwasi Kwarteng, and the very small number of people who voted for them. And I feel that I've been directly impacted by what they did in those few weeks, and the ramifications are affecting us in our pocket, and it's scary. And also childcare costs, I don't work full time. Would I like to work full time? Yes, I love my job. Can I afford it? Not sure that I can. We just don't know what's coming down the road. And also another thing, I have flats that I let out to people, and the people in those flats, they're sitting pretty. I always have under market rents, because I'm one of the only people in Edinburgh that I know who actually has second properties, who don't do bloody Airbnb. And I know that the council here have done something about that. But I believe in providing homes for people that are not being seem to be provided for anybody else. And these are young kids who've come out of university. They can't buy flats. They're not going to be eligible for any social housing if there was any. They think they're sitting pretty because they're in their flats and there's not going to be any rent rises and everything. They don't realise that I'm looking at, any margins that I make getting smaller and smaller, and top line taxes and everything, and I'm thinking I'm going to sell up, and they'll not be sitting so pretty when they get eviction notice. I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but I might have to do that, So it's okay for people, as far as the Scottish Government are concerned, it's okay for the people who are in housing just now to have these freezes. But what's it going to do for the people coming up who will need houses? It's just going to restrict it. And here's us, we're thinking, well, will we have to move house? What area will we go in? What schools will we end up in? We just don't know. So that's why we're frightened. That's why you're seeing this about parents. I'm not unusual amongst my people. We're all terrified, and we're all middle class. We're all in good jobs, supposedly good jobs. We're all worried.
Thanks. Do the panel want to come in with reflections, or shall I go to more questions?
I just want to come on, both on the kind of housing market points that people have made and the tax point that the gentleman made. I think some of the discussion around the Scottish Government having a fixed budget is about the flexibilities right now this year for this current financial year. And whilst you're absolutely right, under the Scotland Act 2016, income tax has been partially devolved, but the rates and bands are devolved, and the Scottish Government could choose to raise income tax significantly. It also could introduce new taxes, although, to be honest, this has not been fully tested yet, and the Welsh Government are having difficulty introducing a new tax, which is along the lines of what you're talking about on land value and so on. So it does have some power, yes, to introduce new taxes, but any of that would be for next financial year, and it doesn't deal with the issues that they're dealing with right now, particularly on public sector pay settlements. Getting rid of burnout would be a To be honest, Scotland has done pretty well out of Barnet and has been able to spend at a higher level than in other parts of the UK on services as a result of that. And there's certainly an argument for reforming or looking at things around land value. No politician seems to want to grasp the nettle properly on council tax and reforming it and replacing it. And of course there's a discussion about things like wealth taxes, which are possible, but I think difficult to do in a devolved context. So there are lots of ways that the Scottish Government could raise additional revenue, absolutely. But it is difficult for them to do that to help with the current problem of the 22-23 budget. There is a huge problem with housing supply in Scotland, and we've seen a huge amount of crisis, particularly in the cities, particularly among students, but in general about the private rental market. And, you know, I've already said publicly that the rent freeze announcement in the programme for government, or around the programme for government in September, sort of sounds good, but I think there are a lot of potential unintended consequences with housing supply. And at the end of the day, if the supply of private rental properties reduces, it's only going to keep pushing up the prices for those who are looking for it. So, you know, there's lots of literature on the impact of rent controls or rent freezes and so on, and the ways to do it in such a way that it doesn't deter investment. There are ways to do it, but you need to do things like compensate landlords and you know, these different sorts of things. You know, there's a huge problem with the supply of private rental properties. And, you know, I work at a university. We've seen the impact that it's having on students being able to fully take part in the experience of going to university. And it's really quite heartbreaking, some of the stories we're hearing about the you know, what students are going through at the moment, trying to find properties. So I know that doesn't cover everything that people have covered, but I don't know.
Just to bring in one more thing on tax, because it didn't get asked directly, but there's probably people wondering in the audience. In your podcast, when you and David Isa were having a discussion, you mentioned that if Scottish Government was to lower the top rate from 150k to 125k, that might not necessarily result in more money in the budget. Do you want to just say something on that?
Absolutely. So the UK Government lowering that threshold from 150,000 to 125,000, they're estimating that in sort of steady state that's going to raise them about £400 million extra in their budget. If we did the same in Scotland, there being more money raised across the UK means that there'll be a larger deduction from the Scottish Block Grant to reflect the fact that the tax is devolved. So the UK says, well, you now collect the income, so there's a deduction. And that deduction is based on how much is raised in the rest of the UK per head. So if their tax goes up, the deduction goes up. So there's more taken off the Block Grant. We then add back on what we raised in Scotland. And if we do the same, we will raise more tax to the tune of around 40 million a year. But it's not going to compensate for the deduction for the Block Grant, because we just have fewer of these very high income individuals in Scotland. Sort of per head, you know, they're just mostly concentrated in London and the South East, to be honest. So it's, even if we do exactly the same policy as the UK Government have done, albeit the tax rates are already higher in Scotland, let's not forget, you know, the Scottish net tax position is going to be kind of worse off. Now, will the Scottish budget be worse off? It depends. If the UK Government uses that revenue to spend on health, then it will generate Barnet consequentials for the Scottish Government's budget. You can see just this small example highlights how complex this operation of the Scottish budget is. So the budget might not be worse off because of this if the UK Government then spends all of that extra money it collects on health or education, which is fully devolved and will generate Barnet consequentials. So we don't really know yet, because it depends. But we'll see what the Scottish Government announce on the 15th of December. But to me, it seems quite hard to imagine that they might not want to at least try and follow suit.
I guess just to sort of... Oh, no, sorry, go on, Sean.
No, I'll just be very quick. I'm just listening to everybody, you know, the comments that you were making about I suppose, what are the political big ticket items that are out there, you know, economy, health, education, you know, and these are all the issues that frustrate, personally now, I'm going to just speak from, take all my hats off from a personal level, that have frustrated the living daylights out of me over the last few years. And what that has done is got me much more politically invigorated. So any of the work we've done with any of the parties at UK level or Scottish Government level has led to a sense of frustration. And is anybody actually listening to what's going on? At the point of where it becomes really, really frustrating. And that's speaking as somebody in business, speaking as a parent, speaking as a husband of somebody who works in NHS. You know, there's all of these issues that just do not seem to be getting addressed. So I can feel that, you know, many people in the room have the same general, apathy, thank you. It was just to think there's a frustration there, and I see it in all areas.
Mark, you were
It was only just a counterpoint. I suppose I was struck by what you were saying about, you know, doing governing and actually taking decisions. I wonder, and I think I said it in my remarks, over the slight kind of the plateauing, but sort of slight upticking in not feeling quite as pessimistic as we did. I mean, to be clear, the fieldwork for this survey was done before the autumn statement, but after the assistance for energy bills was given. And I do wonder whether that slight uptick is directly because of, you know, to your point, an action actually being taken. I suspect that's probably something to do with it.
I remember, just coming back on your point in the middle, I remember seeing analysis of opinions of the Trust's mini budget, and you had a very different opinion if you paid off your mortgage, because you just weren't worried about the interest rates. I can see another question at the back. I'll come straight to you in a second. I'd like to just ask you one question, Sian. We're seeing data on the labour market with this, not quite calling it a lost generation, but, you know, the 55 pluses choosing to retire. There is some ill health, but actually the IFS analysis seems to say it's people choosing to retire because they don't actually enjoy the workplace that they're in anymore. Are you picking up any of that?
Yeah, we've seen a significant amount of over 50s leave the workplace, leave many of the businesses that we work for, and that's created a big gap, and a skills gap as well, which hasn't been addressed. And there's maybe some legacy issues with regards to how they've adapted to that, but we have seen a number of people, and actually what we've seen out of that percentage, some have decided just to work part-time, change career completely, or just leave the employment market if they can afford to do so. They're never coming back, and it's just an acceptance of that now.
Good afternoon, I'm Johnny Timson. I represent the Group for Autism Insurance Investment University, and we're trying to close the neurodiversity employment gap in the UK. But let me talk about the disability employment gap, if I may, because we're part of that. And I guess disability we've not mentioned so far, but I guess, Mark, thinking back to your presentation, it intersects a lot of your distressed segments, and not necessarily those that are low income. If I speak to you, Sian, about looking at the employment situation in the UK in a minute, we do have a persistent disability employment gap, and it's persistently been much larger in Scotland. Now, are you seeing, given the labour shortage at this minute in time, are you seeing any appetite for employers to attract people with disabilities back into the workplace, make appropriate adjustments? I'm very conscious at the minute we've got a DWP backlog on access to work support, which is a frustration. And I think we need to take a better grip of that in Scotland, to be quite truthful. But I'd be interested in your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to close off the first one. Yeah, and forgive me if I had more time, and I'd be quite happy to share detailed data with you, Charlie. It's we are able to look at the cohort, for example, who are not working due to disability or ill health, and we do see some quite interesting, and I have to say, compared to the population as a whole, quite negative outcomes and views, as you may expect. And I'd be happy to, if I'd had more time, I would have gone into that in a bit more detail. But I can certainly catch up with you separately about that.
I suppose what I would say, just generally speaking, is that what we saw with the significant labour gaps that were created post-Brexit through COVID is that many employers with those gaps had to think differently. And actually that was the positive I'll take from Brexit, and I'm sorry if I'm being quite open about that politically, because there's not many other positives about Brexit in my opinion, but that part of it meant that those gaps were being able to be filled by people that would normally not fill those gaps. But then what we saw as employers were looking at different diverse groupings and looking at how they could advertise and recruit and adapt their workplaces to suit those groupings. I don't think we're anywhere near where we should be, particularly when it comes to disability and many other groupings in Scottish society, but it seems to be going in a better direction. I don't think we're anywhere near it.
I would support that view. I'm very encouraged in Scotland, actually, by the work particularly Jeremy Balfour, MSP, is doing in the call for having a disability commission and commissioner. Because I'm a former Cabinet Office Disability Access Ambassador down from the UK Cabinet. I've been frustrated for some time that the Disability Conference Scheme sounds good, but actually isn't delivering, and certainly not really delivering the people in Scotland. So I certainly do think that we do need a Disability Commissioner who can challenge, champion and convene on behalf of not just disabled people, but carers as well, because there are conscious Carers Week coming up. There are another forgotten audience that really don't have a share of voice. And I certainly think that if we can get that commissioner appointed in Scotland, would be great. We certainly do need that commissioner appointment replicated across the other nations in the UK. Thank you.
Sorry, we'll go straight into another question because we're rapidly running out of time.
Okay, I'll be as quick as I can. Richard Hunter from Grayling Communications. I was just struck by the finding in the data that one of the areas people were reducing their expenditure most is in culture and leisure and hospitality. Declaring an interest as a former fringe and festival and theatre worker myself before I got this current job, I was just wondering whether the difference in spending habits has been observed in any other data sets, whether businesses in that sector are being disproportionately affected by the current economic difficulties, and whether even if the economic picture improves in the next 12, 18, 24 months with regards to people's confidence, whether those sectors might still face a slower recovery and more prolonged difficulties.
I would say that other business surveys are signalling that businesses in these sectors tend to be more worried because they can see surveys like this and other consumer confidence surveys clearly signalling that people are cutting back on non-essential spending. So if people they're going out less, if they are going out, they're spending less. And these sorts of things is what these businesses seem to be both seeing and are worried about that it will actually continue. There's been announcements so the UK government announced in their statement last week that there would be more business rates relief for businesses in these sorts of sectors, presumably to reflect this worry about how well these businesses are going to survive, particularly because many of them had very tough times over COVID. And are probably much more heavily indebted than they were prior to the pandemic. So they're sort of just getting by now. So if their revenue starts to decline further, then they might be in trouble. So that's another thing that we'll be interested to see in the Scottish budget, to see if that's replicated in Scotland. I imagine those businesses will be very vociferous in their insistence that that should happen here. So it does chime with other things that we're seeing. You know, it does tend to be the way that these are the things that people cut back on first. And we can see in all of the data, not just Mark's data, but also NS data on opinions and lifestyles, is that people are certainly cutting back on non-essentials, but from a kind of health and child poverty point of view, are also cutting back on essentials now as well, as the cost crisis really starts to bite.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can add to that. I've spoken to 2 or 3 people in relatively sort of senior positions in the local kind of cultural sector since, in sort of preparation for today and for the launch of the report. And yeah, and they reflect what Mary's saying. There is some concern, I think, that some of the recovery funds that were available during COVID have been, this is not my wheelhouse, right? So I'm sort of trying to remember what they were saying to me, but some of those COVID recovery funds have since been withdrawn, and clearly if they're not replaced by the types of assistance that Mary's talking about, then it kind of stands to reason that there are going to be a lot of cultural businesses that are going to struggle, to put it extremely mildly.
We talk to a lot of people in different roles as part of our research on different subjects, and it's coming through quite strongly. The cultural sector is really worried, but you don't need to ask people to know. We're not far from the film house here. It's just closed. Cineworld is in administration, isn't it now, or just teetering on the edge of it? You know, this world is going to change dramatically, and I think we're probably going to need to look to philanthropists to save it, to be honest, because, you know, it feels like the NHS is going to be the priority in public spending terms. So culture is going to be seen, I think, whether or not we want it to be, as a nice to have rather than an essential. And it seems to be what individuals are saying. They're voting with their feet at the moment. There was obviously huge caveats in that, because we know culture's there for people's rich lives. So don't quote that saying I'm slagging off the culture sector. I'm totally not. Before I come to the panel, because we're rapidly running out of time, and I know there's so much more you could say, so I'll come to you for your final thoughts. When I was reading this research, it really made me think about another piece of research we published about a month ago on the Great Risk Transfer. And it really comes through in this, the precarity of people's lives that they maybe had now as we go into this new recession, that they maybe didn't have in previous recessions. And I think if you've not read that report, really please do read it, because it's really important to understand if you're in a comfortable position, you might not necessarily understand why it's so much worse this time. And I think we only need to see the number of, not in our research, but other research I've seen, the number of people stopping investing in their pensions because they need the money to put food on their table today is just giving us a problem down the line further. We know there's big pension cliff edges, because pensions in the future are not going to be of the type that we've got today. So, I think there was, I can't remember if it was IFS or someone else's research last week, and they broke it down by nationality on average pension pots. And the difference, if you were self-employed and Bangladeshi, your pension pot was minuscule compared to other nationalities. Now, that could be a cultural thing, there could be loads of reasons why, but we need to be aware that there's really stark differences in different areas of the population. So I think that's something that won't come through in this data, but it's worth connecting this to other things that are being talked about and discussed. So that we bring this on time, because I don't like to overrun, I'm going to come in reverse order to panel to leave the room with your final thoughts. Charles.
I think I've got politically invigorated by a lot of the people in the room, but I think there's a feeling that we see the labour market at this point as a bit of a knife edge. It's going to change. There's going to be a bit more elasticity in it as we go into next year. Those people that find themselves looking for work will be able to find work.
So by elasticity, do you mean redundancies?
Redundancies, yeah. Let's say it like it is, yeah. So we're anticipating that from what we see in the economy. If that means that then people can find work easier, if there's still that demand out there, then hopefully that's a little bit of hope. It sounds a really sad way of finding hope, but that's what we're looking at just now. But also I think that it's a time, as we go into next year, that word I used, that perma-crisis, it's not going to change. It'll be something else, but this is the way the economy is going to be, and this is the way that the landscape will be. And politically, I think there's needing to be a bit more of a joined-up approach to take us through and give confidence to the people in this room, but the people in the population that it can be done.
Yeah, I think your point, Susan, about the resilience, I suppose, of people and businesses at the moment, basically since the financial crisis and the stagnation in living standards that we've seen, it is going to be really difficult over the next wee while, and it's very worrying. I think what Chan said is right about government working in a more joined up way to give people as much confidence that they'll sort of will get through it and we'll get to the other side. Just to add, in terms of the gentleman talking about the disability employment gap, we've done a lot of research on adults with learning disabilities and helping them into work, and there's that's an area of policy that quite worries me in Scotland, because it's chopped and changed all the time, and it's now devolved back out to local government, and it's not generally evaluated very thoroughly. And the fact that the budget for that's been kind of cut at the moment to help fund pay deals and all the other things, does really concern me for us actually progressing on these important points when the the supply of labour is so tight that we need to ensure that everybody who wants to and is able to can participate and fulfil their full potential.
Yeah, I suppose just to sort of repeat some of the things that I've already said, but I think the research is clearly really important, not just in demonstrating the current situation, how the nation is feeling, but I think particularly for events like this to flag up what's coming down the line. And I think discussion has been quite helpful actually about how we might, kind of in inverted commas, sort of prepare for that, or at least get ready for it, whether that's through innovation, whether that's just through, preparing our businesses or preparing policy or whatever to try and combat what we see in front of us. And I look forward to coming back in a year or two when maybe I've got something more positive to say.
We'll be back again next quarter.
Yeah, but I don't suspect it'll be much different.
What if? It might be.
Sorry, plot spoiler.
Let's finish on an optimistic
Yes.
note. I think for me, obviously I'm going to thank you all in a minute, but for me the thing is what Murray said there, is how do we use this data to do something with it? And back to the point on action, all of us in our lives have got choices about how we spend our money and make decisions, and can we do anything to create any more resilience or any more actions that might help someone else? There are choices. I think Murray highlighted it, the 40% reduction in charity donations is massive and will have huge implications in Scotland. But I don't want to finish on a negative note. I want to finish with the fact I thank you all for turning out on a cold, the beginning of winter, first really hard frost this morning, or was it second? I'm not sure. But probably had harder frost if you're from further afield. But yeah, it feels like the weather's turned. We're probably all going to, if we're able, to be turning up those heating dials. So spare a thought for the people in this survey and that not in this survey that can't do that. Thank you to the MSPs that have taken time out your day. I know how busy your days are, so we really appreciate you coming, and everyone else who has turned up. We love these discussions because we see the ideas bounce off other people, and then we go away and other people email us with, you made me think about this, and that feeds into more work that we will do in future. So please do keep in contact. What's left is to thank the speakers, Mark, Murray and Sian. We love them, how they bounce off each other and give different perspectives. It's brilliant. So David Hume Institute is all about conversation and how we use that conversation to drive action forward. So please do keep in touch. And this is probably our last face-to-face event this year. I don't think we'll manage to squeeze another one in before Christmas. So it feels odd to be saying this in November, but have a happy, safe Christmas if you can. Thank you very much.